Always remember the last one because it's easiest. So the United States spends twice as much on its healthcare as other industrialized countries to worse results by the numbers. We have a very messed up healthcare system where if you get sick or injured, you're more stressed out about navigating the bureaucracy and paying for it than you are trying to get better. It's so terrible here. And so there's so much money in the system that it's going to be a massive. So I'm for single-payer healthcare, Medicare for all. Because 94% of new jobs don't have healthcare coverage anyway. They're all like temporary gig contractor jobs. It doesn't make sense to tie it to employment anymore. That system never made sense. Like no other country is like, oh, you have a job and you like healthcare. Like, you know, it doesn't make any sense. So that's number one. Your first question about the headline unemployment rate. The headline unemployment rate measures the number of people who are in the workforce who are looking and can't find a job. So that number is like 3.7%, as you say. Multi-decade low, very, very rosy. What it does not include is that the labor force participation rate in the United States, which is how many people are actually in the workforce, is down to 62.9%, the same levels as El Salvador and the Dominican Republic, and a multi-decade low. 1 in 5 prime working age American men between the ages of 21 and 30 has not worked in the last year. Now, none of that figures into the unemployment rate because as soon as you leave the workforce, then it actually improves the unemployment rate because you're no longer in the workforce looking. And what's funny is Donald Trump said exactly the same thing I'm saying while he was running for office, and then he just stopped saying it when he became president, but none of the stats changed. There's still 94 million Americans who are out of the workforce. And again, so here are some of the stats. Labor force participation rate, multi-decade low. Life expectancy declined for 3 years. Suicide rates, sky high. Marriage rates, record low. 40% of American children born to an unmarried mother, record high. Like, you know, like any indicator you look at shows that this society is disintegrating. And the headline unemployment rate is essentially government misinformation at this point. It's just a terrible, terrible measurement. And people just keep using it. So this country has 3 major economic measurements. GDP, which is also terrible. And one of the comments I make is that my wife is at home with our 2 boys, one of whom is autistic. What does GDP value her work or contribution at? 0. What does the monetary market value her work at? 0. But I know that she's working much harder than I am, you know, and she's doing something much more important. And so GDP is a terrible measurement that's actually leading this country into ruin because everyone just worships GDP. When the trucks drive themselves, that's going to be great for GDP. It's going to be very bad for the truck drivers and then the 5 million Americans who work in truck stops, motels, diners. So if you look at the social indicators, it's all going to the toilet. The other major economic indicator is stock market prices. Guess what percentage of stock market wealth the bottom 80% of Americans own? It's like 8%. And then the bottom 50% own 0. So if you talk about stock market wealth, you're talking about something that affects the top 20% of Americans. The bottom 80% essentially see none of that. So these are like really this country has a major, major measurement problem. And it has not updated its measurements in decades. It invented GDP during the Great Depression. It's like almost 100 years ago. So one reason why someone like me is necessary for this country is that I can like update the measurements. Like that would literally be like the greatest service you could actually do to this country is just update them to more rational, human-centered measurements to give people a sense of how we're doing. And that's one of my platform elements, as you'd guess. So I think I got your questions, right? Did I miss one? Oh yeah, oh right. So the other central problem you had is like, look, people need work. Universal basic income does not give them work. Jobs are better than money. That's like the basic thrust of it. And I agree with all of that. People do need work. Jobs are better than money. The problem is that the US government, and most any government, would be a miserable failure at trying to create jobs for this many people that were not truly terrible, abusive, exploitative. It's like that old story about, I think it was Milton Friedman, who was in China, when there was a construction site. Lonnie, you know the story, where like there were just a bunch of guys with shovels instead of bulldozers and tractors. And the guy went over and said, where are all of the tractors? And then the government official said, like, no, this is a jobs program. So we don't want to give them any equipment. And then Friedman looked at it and said, then why give them shovels? So that's where the US government would head if it was just like, hey, it's time to create jobs for everyone. Because the US government would end up creating all of these makeshift jobs that don't really make sense. And then if the population in the US was then dependent on the government for those jobs, the best way to create jobs in this country is by putting money into the hands of Americans who would then spend it on car repairs, restaurants, tutoring for their kids, and then all of those businesses would then create the jobs that you're looking for, and then they would hire the Americans. That's the best way to create jobs in this country. People have it wrong. It's like, hey, if I give them a job, that'll give them money. The American government would be unable to do that. The only thing the American government is able to do is give them the money, and then the economy would then create 4 million jobs.